This is just a short film on a few different ghost stories that I've heard in my family down through the years. The first one concerns my grandfather. When his children were small, he lived in 55 Mountjoy Street in Dublin city centre in Ireland. And the house they lived in, the rooms were let out to different families, so different families lived in it. It was a tenement house, but it was in good condition. It was a good house, and it was a woman and her brother who owned the house. The woman played a harp, and a man had hanged himself in the house not too long before my grandfather moved in with his kids. And there was all these stories that the man he hanged himself from the banisters and was hanging down, and his legs were banging off the banisters, and people were saying they were hearing all these noises at night. But anyway, when my grandfather was living there, he was a great man for seeing spirits and things like that. And one night he heard this like crying, and he got out of the bed and he looked out the window, and when he looked out, there was a woman standing in the garden, an older woman standing in the garden with her arms outstretched, and this was in the middle of the night. And he called my grandmother to come and look out the window, but she said it was too cold. She didn't want to look out. She said it must be cats, to ignore it. So he went back into bed, and next day went to work. But in the meantime, the woman in the next room, young couple, she was seriously ill with TB, and she wasn't expected to live very long. And her mother travelled from Naas in County Kildare to visit her. And when she did, she called to see her daughter in the room. She just keeled over and died. So my grandfather was home from work, and the dead woman was still in the house. And my grandmother told my grandfather what had happened, and they went in to pay their respects to the deceased woman. And when they went in, she was in one side of the bed, and her daughter, who was sick, of course, was on the other side of the bed. And my grandfather said that the woman who had died was the woman he had seen in the backyard, who had only travelled from Naas that morning. But it's like as if he actually saw her before she died, and he swore up to the time he died that this was a true story. A couple of other things happened in that house too. There was another incidence of crying as well. Everybody in the house was talking about crying that was going on coming from the basement. And my grandfather, he was a brave kind of a man. He decided that he would go to the basement and see what the crying was. And he made his way down, and he heard the crying, and when he stepped back up the steps away from it, the crying would stop. When he stepped back down the steps, the crying would happen again. And he went in, but he didn't find anything, cats, nothing. The basement was just empty. But it was later revealed that there was a young woman who'd had a baby, and that she was living in the basement, and that the baby had died in the basement some years before they were there. That was just a story they found out. And there was my grandfather again. There was another incident where his father had a car that he bought, and it had belonged to two old ladies who lived out in Bray in County Wicklow, and they had a man that used to drive them around in the car. And one day the car turned over, and both of the old ladies died from shock. So the car was hanging around, and my great grandfather bought the car, and he was out driving in the car, and one of his other sons was in the car with him, and the two old ladies kept showing up in the back of the car. In one case they nearly turned over again in the car, such a shock they got. So they decided they would get rid of the car, and they sold the car on to somebody else, not saying anything about the apparition in the back. And shortly after they sold the car to another man, he was out driving it, and the car turned over near Dalkey in County Dublin, and his reason for turning over the car, he said, was because he'd seen the two old ladies sitting in the back seat of the car. So that was another incident. My grandfather again, he was down in Wexford, I think it was, or maybe somewhere else, and there was a pub called the Spotted Dog, and he was brought to this pub, with himself and my grandmother, brought to this pub by friends of theirs. And there was some renovation work going on at the back. It was a very old pub called Spot the Dog. My grandfather wanted to visit the toilet, and he had to, because of all the renovations, they had a temporary toilet set up at the back, and he had to walk across the yard to visit the toilet. And as he was walking across the yard, he saw an apparition of a woman, an old woman with a long cloak on or something, crying, you know. And he tried to move past her, but he found it hard to move past her, and she was telling her to go away. He felt she was from another time, and in the meantime he saw this half man from his head to his waist with no legs, standing not too far from him. So my grandfather swung his hand out to say go away to the man, and his hand went right through it, and as his hand went through it, he froze right up to his head, and he stood there. In the meantime, the grandmother and the friends in the pub were wondering, where the hell has he gone? And they went out and found him in a state of shock. They brought him in. He was in shock for the rest of the night, and he couldn't speak or anything, and he described what happened. So the owner of the pub later told him that some famine people were buried, people who had been in the famine of the 1840s were buried there, and some other things that went on, and they felt that some of the graves were disturbed when they were doing the renovations. But this was the reason they gave. But he was in shock for a few days. He just froze, and he eventually got over it and told us about it. But he had many stories, but that's just a few of them. So that's just a few stories, as I said, of my grandfather, and he had many a story and many what he called it true events that really did happen, and which we enjoyed as when we were children, listening to him here in Dublin. And he just had a psychic gift, I suppose. Thank you for listening.